So it's a real pleasure to be with all of you and to our panelists here who I'll introduce to you in a second. So you can see people come from all over the world. They tend to join us because of their interest in emotions and education, healthcare, all kinds of business. And so it's fun to really tackle subjects like creativity and emotion because that spans every aspect of work life and home life. And I wanted to introduce you to our panel. I'll introduce you to Zorana Icevic first. She's a PhD and an award-winning senior research scientist at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. She specifically studies the role of emotion and emotion skills in creativity and well-being, as well as how gender and gender-related attitudes affect the experience of work. Her work has been published in journals like Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin, Journal of Personality, Applied Cognitive Psychology, Creative Research Journal, and Journal of Creative Behavior, and others. So anyway, we can say she's widely published and she's legit. So that said, we're also welcome here Tanya Webb, who is an experienced HR executive and creative designer. And in addition to her work that she does at Build Partners, which offers diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy consulting, she also runs Ink and Spark. It's a company that she started and built herself, which is an e-commerce marketplace for products that support diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. In her prior roles, she has led DE&I efforts at Puppet, which is a global software company based in Portland, Oregon, and was recognized as one of Portland Business Journal's 2019 Women of Influence for driving impactful initiatives in support of DE&I within the Portland tech community. So welcome to you, Tanya.
Thank you.
And James Nicholas Kinney also joins us from LA today. He's the Chief Talent Officer at Mother, which is an independent creative agency that has offices around the world and has over 13 years of experience as an in-house practitioner and external consultant. He's been featured on CNN, NBC Smart Money, and NASDAQ Disruptors, and he's also running for office next year. Right?
That's it. Thank you for
the
information.
You're welcome. And then Annie Sway, she is based in the Bay Area and has over 15 years of experience in creative direction, entrepreneurship, and design. She was a co-founder of a company called Cooley Cooley, which is a superfood startup and a benefit corporation that helped shape, she helped shape the brand into a multi-million-dollar business. She is driven by a passion for creative thinking and inspiring positive change. And today, Annie works with some of the industry's brightest minds and game changers with a focus on establishing meaningful brands and carving a path for the future of women in creative leadership. So looking at everything that all the expertise we have in this panel today, I thought we'd set out with a very broad question, which is, how would you define creativity? So I'm going to ask Zorana to go last because she might come at it with a scientific angle, but it is so interesting to look at the different ways we might even approach the very word we're here to discuss. So James, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, shout out to Hillary Black. I'm giving shout outs. Creativity is a uninhibited process of expression with a deliverable that may show up in any form, tangible and or non-tangible. That's my final answer.
Okay, we'll take it. Annie, how about you?
Yeah, I think creativity is about being open to ideas and having the ability to actually express those ideas. Creativity is not something that can be owned. It's a kind of energy. It's almost like a life force of its own. I don't know if anyone's ever read Big Magic by Liz Gilbert, but she talks about creativity broadly. And it's also a means for survival and resourcefulness. So creativity is often employed in any situation where we have to survive or we have to come up with a solution for a problem. So I think it's one of the most important tools and skills to have.
Yeah, thank you. Tanya.
Yeah, so thank you. So for me, how I would define creativity is basically trying to achieve an outcome that is either fulfilling a need or solving a problem. So it could be on any level, right? Personal, social, professional. And really, for me, it is so deeply tied and triggered by emotions. So the best of times and worst of times have driven amazing and horrible, designs or solutions. And so, and in addition to what James and Annie have mentioned as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Zorana.
And thank you everybody for the definitions, and they are they're very on point. And the research on creativity, which is my perspective on the definition, is mentioning all the elements that other panelists have included in their definitions. So creativity scholars define creativity as a process that includes thinking, development, and doing of something that is both original and appropriate or meaningful in some way. Those aspects of originality and meaningfulness are important because sometimes something that is just original and very, very different could be bizarre, and if it's just bizarre, it might not really be creative. But the meaningfulness component is there to complement the originality. And as you mentioned, those aspects of emotions are very prominent in creativity, and aspects of the process that include flow and openness to experience are key components that contribute to creativity.
Great. So I'm going to ask you another question, Zorana, and then see how James, Annie, and Tanya might respond to that, which is, in your research, what kind of emotions actually create an environment where creativity can flourish?
That is a great question, and psychologists have studied this question for now 35, 40 years. The answer to it depends on what part of creativity and creative process we look at. I think that the best answer to the question overall, when we pose it as what emotions are good for creativity, is that there isn't an answer to it. There isn't a single answer to it. There are lots of different emotions that happen in the creative process. Some are more likely to appear in the part of inspiration. Some are more likely to appear during the creative process. And a better question would be, how do we use and regulate emotions that happen in that process? So we know that creative process is very difficult, sort of by definition, because you have to do something that doesn't have an obvious solution or an obvious path forward. And there are going to be ups and downs. How we manage these ups and downs is going to be crucial for creativity.
Yeah, so James, Annie, or Tanya, do you want to respond to that and how that actually shows up in practical forms in the workplaces you've been a part of?
Yeah, so I've had the privilege to study neuroscience a bit and the correlation of neuro inputs and outputs associated with creativity. And I'm not sure, I think that it starts from a neuro standpoint and then it shows up from a psychological perspective and then emotional. So I would say for sure, based off my experience and the populations that I've managed, as well as being a creative myself, that oxytocin and dopamine, I think, are closely correlated and linked to what I would consider to be successful outputs of creativity. But I would also say any sort of high levels of cortisol will shut down creativity from a hormonal and a neurochemical standpoint. And then from there, I think emotions can show up in lots of different places. But I would say, based on my personal experience, if you don't feel safe and cortisol levels are really high, it would likely be hard to be creative. And I'd love to hear what Tanya and Annie have to say.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. So in regards to the cortisol, I find that interesting because having been a designer, creative that has, I've had a very portfolio career. A lot of the work that I've done as a creative has largely been very cortisol driven, which is kind of ironic. The work that we do is often based on really tight deadlines and a host of emotions from our clients or our colleagues. And oftentimes that could fuel some of the outputs of creativity. Now I'm really curious about how that compares to, say, being in a truly flow state, being able to work in an environment where there isn't that kind of high level of stress or that sort of like really strict deadline oriented workflow. So it's almost like being a creative professional today is contrary to that definition that you're saying there, as a creativity can most happen when there isn't that kind of stress level.
Yeah.
It's an open question, so I'm really curious to see what everyone else has to say.
So I'll jump in response to both you and James in terms of that safety and just the flow, because I've had opposite experiences where I'm in pure panic mode and desperation, right? And so going back to the best of times and the worst of times, and just the broad range of emotions that can trigger, again, the creativity or the problem solving, to where I've been in complete, I mean, I've shut down, but then again, it for some reason has spurred like that immediate gateway of flow, right? Where I do enter, and then all of a sudden it's the best work that I've done. And so I will say that being able to accept and recognize that you don't always have to be in this positive state to, trigger creativity. And that just, it goes to that openness of, just kind of accept your environment and the emotions that you're going through, and kind of, that will guide you. Because I've been through both the, oh my gosh, panic, hair's on fire, what am I going to do? I'm never going to meet this, to having ultimate free time, free reign, and not being able to come up with anything. So.
Yeah. It reminds me of this old phrase of pressure makes diamonds.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so, Zorana, why is that? Why is that, what Annie and Tanya are really pointing to, that like the pressure is on, the deadline is imminent, and that creates a breakthrough in creativity, where sometimes when we do have all the time in the world, we feel really stagnant.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes too many options is not productive, because one can get lost in too many options, and constraints can at times be very productive for creativity because they can focus one's direction. But what Annie and Tanya were talking about, I was nodding because I recognized a lot of things that we study from a very practical examples that they shared. When we study emotional intelligence, the basic idea behind it is that emotions are information. So emotions are telling us what is going on in our environment, and the environment can be in your head, or the environment can be really literally around you. So when you are in that state of panic, you have some information. You have information that there's a pressure, you have to perform a certain thing. It focuses your attention to only more narrow set of ideas, or only narrow set of things you're going to play with. And then out of that focus, something can emerge. And you are learning from frustration. Frustration is teaching you that there is a problem, and that what you were trying to do, approaches you were trying to do, are not working. You better do something different.
Yeah. So I'm also wondering, because what I hear you saying, Zorana, is like frustration, the awareness of feeling frustrated that some sort of progress is being blocked, actually can create a doorway for a different set of emotions, which might set us on a pathway of curiosity or exploration that breaks the block. And along with that, and then we've talked about this before as panelists, what kind of constraints go into thinking about who's allowed to be creative? I'm curious about, somebody in the asked the panelists here about like the ethical aspects of creativity, about what gets created, but also who has the right to create, which is a big topic in and of itself. Annie, you've said before, creativity is a loaded word. Do you want to maybe explore a little bit about what that means to you?
Sure. I'll go back to my definition of creativity, just because I think creativity in itself is, I want to say in a layman sense, it's a tool or a process that all of us have. Like, we can all be creative. And oftentimes I think the word creativity in today's world, it's branded differently. Like, there's this sort of connotation around creativity in that, oh, well, only artists get to be creative. People who do like the arts, or they work in some sort of like non-linear sort of job function, that's considered creative, or where they have to do, there's another term, out of the box thinking. But I really think true creativity comes from the ability to solve problems when you have very limited resources. Sometimes you don't have enough data points, and sometimes you don't have enough time to gather all the data. And while a lot of strategists, researchers in the world love to have the time to be able to do all the research and get all the information before forming coming up with an informed opinion, sometimes creatives do not have that sort of luxury. So I gotta say, everybody has the ability to be creative. It's just, we have to sort of take that that lens off, like the modern lens of like, creativity is not limited to a very specific profession. I think everybody has the ability to be creative. And then I'll just add one more thing on the topic of ethics. I think everybody, regardless of whether you consider yourself a creative professional or not, we all have the responsibility for the outcomes or the consequences of our choices, whether we are doing something that's creative or not creative. So that's my answer to that.
Yeah. James or Tanya?
Thanks, James. So I'll jump in, and I wholeheartedly agree with what Annie is saying about everyone has the ability. And, from your question, Andrea, about who's allowed, sadly, when you're looking at organizations, there is a perception of, who in organizations are deemed, to be creative versus the non-creative, right? Perceptions, AKA biases, and so on and so forth. And, there's different levels, right? There's from an organizational perspective and where people sit functionally. Are they in marketing? Are they in accounting or finance? There's individuals from personal attributes, right? And the fact that perhaps one group of or an Asian person, for example, might not be seen as being super creative because the stereotype is that perhaps they're more analytical or data driven. And then there's the individual where that perception around creativity is, oh, I am sitting in this function. I am not seen, nor do I have official credentials to be able to apply to a marketing job. Therefore, I am not even going to try it because I'm not even going to be, considered. And so there are definitely, from what I see, multiple levels of that perception of, okay, who's allowed, who's perceived to be, again, deemed creative people versus non-creative people. And then to your point, Annie, about, the word creativity in and of itself, I would say, okay, if you're in a meeting, men, women, everybody, and someone brings up an idea, it would be interesting to note if a man says or presents this idea, oh, you're super innovative, versus a woman presenting the same idea and the notion is, oh, you're so super creative. So there's the language piece of it, perception, and yeah, and I can go on and on.
Tanya and Annie, I love what both of you said. And Zorana, I remember yesterday you started with this teaching us more about this overarching workplace experience. So as primarily as an HR professional, man, this brings up so much for me. It brings up unconscious bias conversations of who's supposed to be and should be, gender biases. But it really lands to me with inclusion. And if you have cultures of belonging, and if workers, knowledge workers in particular, probably on this call, are able to bring their whole selves to work, to Annie's point, you want your finance team to be creative. You want your HR people to be creative, your recruiters to be creative. You want your facilities people to be creative. Like the flowers in front of the building should look beautiful, right? Because that's a gorgeous part of life. The food should smell good and taste good. So there's creativity opportunities, to Annie's point, everywhere around. And potentially, if we are able to encourage creativity at a broader scale from a pure perspective of inclusiveness, not only will our workplaces be better, but our communities will be better, right? So I'm in LA, there's a tent city right down the street. There's creativity there because they're surviving, going back to what I'm learning from my colleagues here. It's survival. They're making toilets, they're making tents, they're making houses. So ethically, and this is where I'm stuck, and it's a great moment for me to be stuck, is that version of creativity down the street in a tent city deemed as valuable as us on this call that are running campaigns for Fortune 500 companies? I hope I just tripped everyone up on this call, but it's a cool thing to think about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't know the answer.
Yeah, I don't know that I know the answer either. And I love that you put this question out for us to look at and consider. And maybe I'll unfairly throw it back to Zorana to talk a little bit about, what the research of her workplace studies have shown us around what our panelists have brought up so far.
I think that the point that James was making in what kinds of creativity are being valued in our culture is a very important one. So we are celebrating in our culture those forms, as he mentioned, working with those Fortune 500 companies, but we don't even notice creativity of people who are trying to survive and using their creativity for basic survival. We also tend to disregard creativity that happens in everyday life and interactions. We are here sitting in the time of a pandemic, and many of us have children and have to somehow engage them and keep them together and keep them connected and well in these times that are very challenging. And we do not have those well-being creating experiences that we are used to. So those are all important aspects of creativity that are not considered enough, that are not acknowledged enough, are not studied enough, but we glorify Steve Jobs's of the world instead. In our own research, one specific thing that we have examined, this is not to say this is the only one in existence, but one that we have studied in some detail, is the issue of gender differences in creativity. And we have done a very large study across all industries in the United States. So going back to what all the panelists have mentioned, and I was so glad to hear that creativity exists and has a potential of existing in every human endeavor. And we have seen very consistently that women are telling us they receive less support from their supervisors and their organizations to be creative in their work. And that has consequences, because if you know that you're not going to have support, you are less likely to attempt something. You're less likely to attempt something because you know it's going to be judged in a particular way. You're going to be judged that this is not your place to do, and this is not what is expected from you. And you can even have negative consequences for attempting to do something creative in your job role. So these are very important questions that bring us back to that issue of equity that multiple panelists have mentioned so far. It is important from the ethical standpoint to include all people who can contribute, even if we want to make an argument from a purely cold standpoint of using human potential. We are not using human potential of many people in our organizations. I hope that conversations like this make people consider, how can we show that support if we mean it in our head but might not be visible?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you all have held or currently hold leadership roles, and I'm curious, when it comes to equity and inclusion, and we think about hierarchy and how it can either support a creative environment or hinder a creative environment. What advice would you have about creating work environments that are hierarchical, that would allow for more people to express creativity, to what Zorana is saying, would actually improve the outcomes for the organization?
Can I go first on this one?
Yeah.
So yes, I've managed organizations upwards of 1,000 people. Currently, I manage a population of about 500 globally. I think hierarchy works because it's clear, it's consistent, you can understand it from a binary perspective, right? However, and this is a big however, I think that all executives and leaders in certain touch points of hierarchy need to go to Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence or OG Life Lab or do emotional intelligence work. I'm serious, because if we're talking about emotional intelligence and creativity, to me, the big aha of this call is that emotional intelligence is the gateway to creativity, because if not, it's suppressed. And I'm watching the comment box, and absolutely, it can be suppressed by race. It can be suppressed by gender. It can be suppressed by geography. Oh, this person's from Alabama. They may not be as smart as someone from New York. It's just not true, right? It's suppressed by socioeconomics. It's suppressed by so many things. So when we're addressing in one of my books, I talk about the 18 plus systems of oppression that exist, right? That emotional intelligence and that EQ has to be a part of the requirement of leadership in order for effective creativity to be had. Without that, to Zorana's point, the organization is operating at 50% of what it could be without that opportunity for full autonomy and creative expression in all forms, to Annie's point and to Tanya's point.
Yeah, I would like to jump in and very much agree with what James was saying. We have done a study where we explicitly addressed that. We had the same standing point, and what we found is that in workplaces, people's supervisors have an outsized influence on their experience. On their emotional experience, their satisfaction, but also on what people are able to do in their jobs. And we ask people to describe their supervisors, to what extent they are emotional intelligence. So do they notice when people are feeling dissatisfied or frustrated? Do they acknowledge it? Do they know how their decisions are going to impact people emotionally? And we found that those supervisors who are able to show their emotional intelligence in their work, they are creating a climate where people can grow in their jobs, they can learn new skills, and they also are better able to show and achieve something creatively. So we are clearly showing this difference, and we very vividly see what kinds of emotional climates supervisors are showing us. Those with low emotional intelligence are creating a climate of anger and dissatisfaction, of people feeling that they are undervalued and that they are irritated, frustrated, and aggravated, versus feeling motivated and fulfilled for those who have supervisors who are really showing their emotional skills at work.
Annie or Tanya, do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I'll say something. I think one thing that happens in a hierarchy, and I agree with what James said about, every organization needs hierarchy. It sort of just lets all of us understand who does what, understand our functions and our roles. However, I think sometimes hierarchy could be detrimental to creativity, especially for those who might be more junior, maybe in a function that, they may have so many levels of supervision above them. And yes, while it's important to have, managers and supervisors and leadership that have emotional intelligence, I think part of what is important about emotional intelligence is ability for oneself to recognize I may not be the most creative person in the room, or I may not have all the answers. Can I delegate that and allow the people that are working under me to express their creativity and express their ideas and actually allow them to be heard? Now, furthermore, in any kind of organization that has hierarchy, usually it comes down to giving credit where credit is due. So sometimes you have a whole team of really creative employees, but then when one person or two people have great ideas, guess who gets the credit? So I think there needs to be some sort of like lateral sort of communication or relationship within any organization, even if there's a top-down aspect, but there has to be something that's more connected between the leadership at the very top and those who may be at the very bottom or in the most junior levels of positions.
Yeah.
Can I follow up to that? Annie, I love that you brought that up too. So I've been, so at Spotify, there's this kind of famous videos and some white papers that are online. Spotify didn't invent it, but it's called Squads and Tribes. I'm not sure if anyone's heard of it, but basically there's these new ideas of org structure that are much more like what you said, where you're part of 4 different groups. There's it's almost like a Dungeons and Dragons game that yes, I'm a part of the organization, but I'm also a part of this, but I'm also a part of that. And if you think about this decentralized, is the way that I would call it, decentralized form of teams and information, it does allow for a lot more autonomy, which is, Arana, you could tell us if that word makes sense with being creative. But you're right, like the 100,000 employee model, I haven't worked in companies that big, so I wouldn't know how to take that and decentralize it. But to your point, yeah, you definitely have to be closer to the money, so to speak, closer to the creativity, so that it doesn't feel so top down. And I think expression flourishes more in those environments. And I know, like Navy SEALs, they're in units of 5 or less on purpose, because if you're out in the bush and you have a gun, you can't communicate with 27 people at once. So you have to break that communication down into smaller chains in order to be effective. So thanks for that.
Yeah, I wonder, Zorana, too, if it might be worthwhile. I know that people who join these webinars are generally familiar with the concepts of emotional intelligence, but when you talk about the skills of, emotion skills being useful in creating environments where creativity can thrive, what would you say those skills are?
That's a great question to get us kind of grounded, because sometimes people really think of emotional intelligence as overly inclusive. Emotional intelligence is not about being a good person, but it's about very specific skills. So it includes 4 big groups of skills. The most fundamental one is to perceive emotions accurately in oneself and in others. So we probably can all think of individuals who believe that they are good at reading emotions, but they are really not. So that's that accuracy component, that if you think something is going on with a person, they might be feeling down, that you are basing that on observation of the right cues. Another component of emotional intelligence is using emotions to help thinking and problem solving, like what we discussed before, where you are experiencing frustration and realizing, oh, this means that I am encountering a problem and that my previous approach does not work, therefore you change an approach. Another one is understanding emotions, which means knowing where emotions are likely coming from and how they progress. So if at one point you were anticipating and then another point you are feeling relieved, you know that something good has happened in between, something that created that release and relief. And the final one, most complex one and most challenging one, is regulating emotions. So regulating emotions, not just to be happier, but also to solve problems and to reach certain goals. Sometimes to reach a certain goal, we might need to be a little bit angry to get us riled up, or we need to feel something that is not just happiness as the only goal of regulation.
You know, it might be interesting for us to hear from participants in terms of which of those skills Zorana just mentioned actually are the most meaningful for you in creating a creative environment that your ideas can thrive or be heard or seen. So if you wouldn't mind making a comment to all the attendees, should you want to play with us around what emotion skills are really helpful to you in generating creative outcomes, what would those be? And while we're waiting for those to come in, I know that's kind of a deep question. Anything else that, yeah, Tanya, do you want to pitch in here?
Yeah, so I love everything that was already said, and I'd love to respond kind of to your question around, what kind of advice and just the hierarchy, and this is, probably more of a tactical thing as far as, me viewing myself as a cog in that hierarchy, right? As a manager, having managed teams as well as reporting to another manager. And so there is something so powerful around, even asking a simple question of your team, the team that reports to you, and saying, hey, would you be willing to correct me or, point things out where it's an opposing opinion of whatever idea I've thrown out there. So it kind of goes back to Zorana, your point about inclusive teams and managers that foster, leaders that foster that creativity, is breaking that down, that initial barrier of, oh gosh, I'm an employee, I have my place, here's my manager. And then on the flip side of that, as an employee to another manager, being able to say to my manager, hey, would you be willing to, not judge me with ideas that I want to throw out there. I just want to do it for the team. So really just putting that emotional intelligence into action, because unfortunately, it's one of those things where people self-proclaim that, yes, I'm an emotionally intelligent, but yet the behavior doesn't follow suit. So. Yeah,
Thanks, Tanya. Lots of interesting answers coming in on the chat around, gratitude that Zorana, you're pointing out, it's not always just the happy, pleasant emotions that invoke a creative environment or spirit, and that other skills that are really useful to people is understanding that emotions happen, that regulation is critical, that there's not judgment about emotions or about perhaps the work and that part of the creative process, but that there's an openness that continues, that creates this spirit of creativity where everyone can participate. I'm also, I mean, this was brought up earlier and some people definitely picked up on it in the chat. What in your mind is the difference between innovation and creativity?
I'm going to
Go
jump.
ahead, yeah.
I always found this question very intriguing. In organizational behavior literature, people define creativity as the thinking part of the process and innovation as the doing and implementation part of the process. But I always found personally that a problematic definition, because let's try to apply that kind of definition to different domains of work, to different areas of what people do. So it might be applicable to business or entrepreneurship, and you might see, yeah, that fits, but we cannot apply it to the arts. So if we think of creativity just as thinking and then innovation as doing, do we say this is an innovative painting or a performance? We don't really use that language. I think that the word creativity really should include the whole process from even before the idea, even the process, as Annie was saying earlier, from that openness, from that desire to do something and think in unconventional ways and approach problems in a different way, having that courage to stand up and do something that is different, and then thinking, coming up with ideas, evaluating those ideas, as Tanya was mentioning earlier, and then building them up into outputs. I think creativity should involve that whole, should be used to denote the whole process.
Yeah, and Zorana, I love that. Andrea, may I add?
Yes.
I think this goes back to Annie's brilliant point, and this is why you are a brander, designer, creative director. There is a brand problem, because when you said innovation, Andrea, I thought of Intel. I literally thought of Silicon Valley as what innovation is. And then if we go back to what we said earlier, we got a tent city down the street. They're pretty innovative. They got microwaves, they got mattresses. They might have a better mattress than me, right? So it's like, it's kind of mind-blowing to potentially understand that we're all living with these like mismatched brands. Like a friend of mine has put out this new series about the brand of the American dream and how it's been like snatched from us. And she pointed out with like empirical evidence that the American dream was original for a long time. And then the real estate industry and the home building market basically stole it and made it about home ownership, and not to take us down that path. But Annie, I'm just giving you a shout and bringing it back to when you said innovation, I didn't even know. I thought it was like an engineering thing. And to Zorana's point, like it shouldn't be that. So it's just kind of fascinating.
Well, thank you, James, for the shout out. And I just want to add to that, and this is to a point I made the other day when we all had a chat. Even within the realm of creativity, and it's totally a branding issue. The way we look at brand, or the brand of creativity today, there's almost like and I think someone, one of the viewers actually suggested, like, you know, creativity is often used for women, but the word innovation, why is that used for men? Or there's something masculine about it. I totally agree. Even in the world of like the creative profession, the word creativity is sometimes poo-pooed on. Like it's often sort of, relegate it to a corner, like, oh, you don't really say creative unless that is literally your job title. Like, I like to say I'm a creative director because that's what's on my business card. But in reality, when I go out and present myself as a creative, I might say, well, I design, right? But as soon as I use the word design, there's something creative about it, but it almost takes that emotional aspect out of the idea of creativity. It's sort of like, let's just like put thinking to it. Let's put the word thinking next to the word design, and now we got innovation, right? So it's almost, you're stripping creativity from the process, but that's not realistic. I think, as Zorana, in all of your work, you're looking at, well, creativity does in fact have so much to do with our emotions. So how can we bring all that back together? And I feel like that's kind of my next project, like how to rebrand creativity so that it's actually what it is.
Yeah. So Ryan, hopefully you've been watching this. I think there's some questions that have popped up, and watching the chat for us too.
Yeah.
What prevailing questions should we put on the table for our panelists as we start to round the last corner of our hour together?
I think you guys have tackled a lot of the things: innovation, creativity, the impact of gender and race. I think this was much of what we're seeing in the chat here. There's an interesting question that came up earlier about the role of creativity in emotional healing. And I've never quite, I'm not the pro like the rest of you guys are. So I'm interested to see what everyone's take is on any relation between creativity and emotional healing, if it exists.
Who's starting on that one?
I know, that's big. I don't know.
James is having a meta moment, so he looked like he was,
I don't know,
he's
Ryan.
brewing something in there.
Yeah. Annie's writing a chapter in her book.
I think Tanya, I feel Tanya has it. I'm seeing.
I do too. Go, Tanya.
So I'm not sure healing is the word, but we talked about this in our prep session, but I often described myself when people would ask, well, what do you do? And I would say, well, by day, I'm this. In the tech world, I do DE&I. But by night, I'm a designer. I am a licensing artist. I create digital art, and it's, sold here and here. And I use that as my form of healing because my day and DE&I was so stressful that I needed some sort of outlet to come home, obviously not take it out on my family or what have you, but I needed some sort of creative outlet to keep me sane and just, so I don't know if that answers the question of the person that asked that. It's a great question, and I'm not sure if that's the direction, but, that was my form of kind of healing and regrouping, recouping. So
Yeah, Tanya, I love that. So like the duality in all of us is something I talk about all the time. And Hillary in the chat and a couple other folks talked about art therapy. And then we just talked about like how hip hop, a marginalized community of people telling stories about the streets and the struggle and pain, and channeling that into something that was pure raw creative expression that then created joy, happiness. Same thing. I mean, like Kurt Cobain, like look at him in rock. It's not just limited to hip hop, his melancholy side and living in Seattle and all that created some of the best rock music. That was it. You have Van Gogh in the chat box.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. James, someone said the most brilliant artists are the most tortured souls. I think that's kind of powerful. It's thinking of obviously hip hop, Tupac and Biggie and Kurt Cobain and other genres. And
Amy Winehouse, I miss you still.
Amy Winehouse.
Oh, Amy. Oh.
I will put on some Amy Winehouse if I'm having a bad day and it makes me feel better. So
Love her.
I love the comment. There was a comment that just came through that said, the most tortured souls are, where was that? make the
Yeah.
best artists or create, you know, are the instigators of beautiful art or creations. And I would completely agree with that. So.
So
Comedy
Zamana,
too,
why
right?
is that?
Yeah, I mean, you see it in comedians that is an outlet for their anger. They use humor. I mean, it is, yeah. When we think about the mood meter, the yellow and green quadrant do not get all the credit for art and creativity. And sometimes, we started talking about stress at the beginning, like pressure makes diamonds. There's good stress and bad stress, right? There's the kind of stress where there's an end in sight that can really urgently move ideas to the surface, and then there's the kind of stress that really depletes us. And so maybe as a way of starting to wrap up here is to talk about, what do you do personally to create the possibility of creativity? How do you prepare for that? What do you do? And what can our attendees take away from that they might want to take into their own practices?
I'll start with this. So one thing I do, I totally agree with what everyone has said, and there's a healing component to artistic expression, and that being a component of creativity. One really interesting thought, and it's something that you've mentioned, is pain can often be a driving force for creativity or artistic expression. But here's a question for all of you. What if it's not pain alone? What if it's simply being in touch with our emotions? That emotion could be about being in awe, being full of joy, being in love. All of those feelings are not necessarily centered around pain, but it's simply being in touch with how we feel. Now, going back to how do we actually, like, what are some practices that I do to get myself into creative mode? I do lots of painting. I admit I'm an artist. This is actually a word that I was so afraid of using. It's also a personal branding thing, right? Like, telling people I'm an artist, it kind of gives people an impression, right? But you know what? Forget it. I think art is absolutely crucial in my personal life and my ability to get creative, to come up with ideas, to create something that's actually useful and relevant and even beautiful, right? That's all part of the sort of design ethos too. It's like, what makes good design? And on top of that, go outside. Like, get out of, get away from your devices, unplug, go out into nature, go for a hike, or even spend time with loved ones. Being present. And I think those are all really important things to think about as we try to figure out, how can I get into that creative space or that creative flow?
I'm going to jump in because lots what Annie was saying was resonating very much with me. And I want to second that it's not about a particular emotion such as pain, but being open to full range of emotions. That's how art is resonating with us, because it expresses a lot of things that are common experience, but in a way that we can say, oh, wish I could have expressed it that way. And personally, I wish that I was an artist, but I am not. But I enjoy art a great deal, and it's a very essential part for my personal well-being. And in lockdown, it has been very hard because I don't have enough art around. It's a way to recharge and to feel that possibility of the humankind. It sounds very corny, I suspect, but being in presence of art makes me feel that humanity is capable of greatness and it's worthy of being human. So that is a big way for me to recharge. And as I was looking at the chat, somebody was asking about that collaborative component and the emotion contagion and creation, and how does that work, and now that we are far away from each other. And I have certainly noticed in myself that oftentimes when I would work on projects with my team in person, I am from the Mediterranean, so very expressive, and I wave my arms. I really like to make it a full body experience and move in space and think and walk or write something physically. And that movement, physical movement, is creating the right space for ideas to flow and to consider them in different ways and perspectives.
Yeah.
James?
Yeah. First of all, shout out to Tanya who's on here. Shout out to all of the participants. You all are incredible. I'm loving the chat box. So many smart, incredible people. So just wanted to recognize everybody across the world. Loving seeing the chat. To add to Annie, so music is my first and only love language. And that explains all the other problems in my life. the music scores my day from start to finish. Music is where it's at for me. It's my barometer. It keeps me going. That's how I tap into write and record and make more music. It's like if I'm working on a deck or a presentation or a spreadsheet, have to go from Radiohead to Sade to house music to bluegrass. It's all over the place. Like when I was driving back to LA the other day, and and I had on like this psych rock artist from London, and man, it just for me it's like I'm on drugs, and I don't do drugs, but music is that deep of a connection for me. That and moving my body. So I'm a yoga teacher and I run. So if I can move my body and I can listen to music, I'm good. And be in nature.
Tanya?
Sorry, super quick question to all of you. If you can turn your creative hobbies or your activity into your livelihood, would you do that?
Yes. I used to. Because I had a band in college and all, yeah.
Ooh, so let's see here. For the initial question, in terms of what I do to try to help prepare myself and to really get my design or our artistic flow, because I was in the consumer world and designing products for the consumer world for a long time, you get really roped into this mode of, well, I'm designing for this. I have to follow this color palette for this buyer or what have you. And so, it was a habit that is an unpleasant habit, especially if you're an artist and you want your own artistic expression. So in the last several years, I've really had to train myself around, if I'm doing something for myself as an outlet, the question I ask myself is, who are you designing for, right? So I always have to pass that gate before I can then kind of prep the stage for myself. And that's really hard for any, people that design or create anything for the consumers. So to answer your question, Annie, so I've been down that route, right? Something was created out of passion and I turned it into my livelihood, my only livelihood. And it's one of those double-edged swords, right? Because it just depends. It ultimately became my job. And at one point in time, different points in time is, it was detrimental and it was stressful. So if you can find that balance of keeping it, still your passion product where it doesn't have your income or nothing else relies on it, then absolutely. If you could find some way to balance that, which is hard, right? So yeah, great question.
Yeah.
Love it.
Yeah, I mean, we could go for another hour, but unfortunately our hour is just about up, and I want to make sure that we have time for Zorana to make a request here for some research that she's going to do at Yale. Do you want to just give us like a 30-second pitch for what you're looking for, Zorana?
Thank you, Andrea. So thank you to all participants and people who are here from all over the world. And I am wondering, and I would like to invite you to be part of a research project we are starting. And we have discussed here, emotions and creativity. And I think one thing that has emerged in this conversation too is that there are creative ways to manage everyday situations and everyday challenges. And that is what we are after in this research. And if there are people who are interested in being part of this research study, I would love you to get in touch. I am pasting my email address here in the chat box, and would love to hear from you, and would love to get your contact information and get you links to the study. And I would be very happy to get back and tell you what we find once the study is conducted.
Really appreciate all of you that showed up today and participated. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Many thanks to our panelists today for really deepening our understanding of how creativity can be deepened and worked with and used more effectively. So thank you all, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Zara.
Thank you, everybody.
Cheers all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Appreciate it so much.